Carissimi amici di Fede Cultura, benvenuti sul nostro canale YouTube. Quest'oggi abbiamo come ospite il professor Peter Kwasniewski, grande filosofo, teologo tomista americano, nonché amante e apologeta, oserei dire, della tradizione cattolica. Che cosa vuol dire tomista? Vuol dire che il pensiero del professore si fonda sul più grande teologo della storia della Chiesa cattolica, cioè San Tommaso d'Aquino. Il professor Kwasniewski è anche un grande studioso di liturgia, oltre che compositore di musica corale. Laureatosi al Thomas Aquinas College in California e poi alla Catholic University of America a Washington DC, ha insegnato presso l'International Theological Institute in Austria e presso la Franciscan University of Steubenville, Austria Program. Inoltre ha contribuito alla fondazione del Wyoming Catholic College nel 2006, dove ha insegnato teologia, filosofia, musica, storia dell'arte fino al 2018. Collabora attualmente con numerosi siti e periodici cattolici americani che orbitano intorno al mondo della tradizione cattolica, alcuni di essi molto famosi, come The New Liturgical Movement, 1 Peter 5, Life Site News, Rorate Celi, Crisis, The Remnant e Catholic Family News. E noi di Fede e Cultura abbiamo pubblicato diversi titoli del professor Kwasniewski, a cominciare da Nobile Bellezza, Sublime Santità, un bellissimo libro di apologia del rito tradizionale della Messa, e più recentemente anche Rinascita, anche questo libro che ha come oggetto di analisi la Messa tradizionale e che illustra il modo con cui appunto la liturgia tradizionale rappresenta la via d'uscita dalla crisi liturgica e dottrinale che ormai da troppo tempo attanaglia la Chiesa cattolica. Professore, grazie dunque per essere qui. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me as a guest.
Dunque, la prima domanda, professore, in altri libri, come per esempio Rinascita, lei sottolinea che la riscoperta della messa tradizionale nel mondo cattolico è la via maestra per recuperare un'identità cattolica forte e per uscire dalla crisi liturgica e dottrinale che stiamo vivendo. Quali sono le ragioni di questa sua convinzione?
What we have to understand is that the liturgical tradition of the Catholic Church isn't just a collection of random actions and words that could have been totally different. Instead, it is the concentration, the collection of the faith of the Church from the earliest era, from the ancient Church. The liturgy is the dogmatic confession of the faith that has accumulated over all of these centuries of faith, of practice. It is the mouthpiece of the church. It is the mouthpiece of the saints. And it is our inheritance. It is our identity. Our identity is contained in the way we worship. Lex orandi, lex credendi, lex vivendi. So that the liturgy also shaped the moral life of Christians. And we see this when we look at the usus antiquior, we look at the old Roman rite, we see that it expresses all of the dimensions of the Catholic faith, not only the comforting and consoling truths, God loves us, God wants to save us, God is giving us the help of his grace, but also the difficult, the hard truths, the challenging truths, that we are sinners, that we're fallen, that we're weak, that we suffer temptation, that the devil is after us, etc. So the traditional liturgy is a summary or a synopsis of the whole Catholic faith. And therefore, in an era like ours of doctrinal ambiguity, doctrinal heresy, and also liturgical experimentation and novelty and banality, we need to to hold fast to a 2,000-year-old heritage. And that's the way out of this crisis. There is no other way out of this crisis.
La nostra casa editrice ha pubblicato recentemente il suo ultimo libro, La vera obbedienza nella Chiesa. Adesso vi mostro ancora una volta, in sovraimpressione, la copertina di questo fantastico libro. Ecco qui, La vera obbedienza nella Chiesa, una guida al discernimento in tempi difficili. Questo libro tocca un argomento molto importante per i cattolici, ossia la virtù dell'obbedienza, una virtù fondamentale, oserei dire. Perché? Perché costituisce davvero il punto di partenza nella scala della santità. E tuttavia, di fronte a numerosi ordini che provengono dalla Santa Sede, dai vescovi, dalle autorità costituite dalla Chiesa romana, non ultimi penso al motu proprio Traditionis Custodes e al rescritto voluto dal cardinale Roche, i fedeli sono sempre più confusi e non si capisce come sia possibile praticare l'obbedienza quando si ricevono ordini iniqui. Ecco dunque la domanda, la riflessione. Vorrei confidarle, professore, questa mia impressione. Lei mi aiuterà a capire se quanto dico può avere senso oppure no. Di fronte al dilemma della vera e della falsa obbedienza, mi viene spesso in mente quanto Sant'Ignazio di Loyola insegnava ai suoi sacerdoti: obbedire come cadaveri agli ordini del Papa e dei superiori. E tuttavia, Sant'Ignazio diceva, se l'ordine dovesse contraddire la dottrina e la morale cattolica, solo in quel caso sarebbe lecito disobbedire. Diciamo così, disobbedire al superiore per obbedire a Dio e alla Chiesa. Ma se l'ordine non contraddice esplicitamente dottrina e morale, per quanto possiamo considerare quest'ordine di ostacolo ai progetti di Dio, addirittura contrario, bisognerebbe comunque obbedire a quest'ordine, sotto pena di disobbedire alla persona di Cristo. Quindi questo mi fa pensare, potremmo distinguere due tipi di atti negativi, diciamo così, provenienti dalla Santa Sede. Alcuni di questi semplicemente proibirebbero, limiterebbero le buone pratiche liturgiche cattoliche tradizionali, ed è il caso dell'ordine proveniente da Traditionis Custodes. Altri invece potrebbero imporre azioni liturgiche apertamente contrarie al depositum fidei e alla liturgia, Dio non voglia. E quindi nel primo caso, obtorto collo, noi cattolici saremmo chiamati a obbedire comunque, anche con dispiacere. Cosa ne pensa allora di questa idea gesuita dell'obbedienza? È corretta oppure no?
I think that the Jesuit notion of obedience is, we can understand how it developed within a militant, almost military organization like the Society of Jesus. However, the obedience that a religious vows to give to his superior is not the same as the general virtue of obedience that all Christians are held to follow. Obedience as a virtue has limits. St. Thomas Aquinas is very clear about this. He has a question in the Summa Theologiae about the virtue of obedience. And he says that the superior has a certain sphere or a certain area within which he commands his subjects. And anything that falls outside of that sphere is not something over which he has authority. Now, the key point is that the Pope has an office in the church. Officium from the Latin means duty, responsibility, obligation. What are the Pope's obligations? The Pope is not an absolute monarch who has no obligations to the people, to their common good, to their spiritual good, or no obligation to the history, the tradition of the liturgy of the church. The Pope, in fact, is hemmed in. He's bound by all kinds of responsibilities, moral responsibilities, in the exercise of his office. As Bishop Mutzerts of Herzogenbosch said, the liturgy is not the Pope's toy. He can't just break it or smash it or reconfigure it however he wishes to do. And so one of the points that's really crucial is when we look at how the papacy is understood throughout the history of the church and how really the episcopacy is understood, I would say it's understood as primarily an office of receiving and transmitting. That is to say, the authority in the church is not for the sake of imposing one's own good ideas or better ideas or worse ideas, but for the sake of receiving from the past, from the faith of the church, the teaching of the popes and councils before, the practice of Christendom, to receive this and then to transmit it in its purity. Yes, the Pope has a certain amount of discretion. He can change disciplinary rules about what days we must fast and how we should fast and how we should abstain. But for example, he doesn't just cancel out fasting and abstinence. That's part of the inheritance of the faith. Yeah. And similarly, the Pope can add a new saint to the calendar. He can add a new preface, but he doesn't have the authority to radically alter the way that Catholics worship. I mean, think about it. What would we say if the Pope one day abolished the Byzantine liturgy? If he said to the Eastern Catholics, you're no longer allowed to use the liturgy of St. John Chrysostom. You need to adopt the Novus Ordo, right? Everybody in the world would condemn this action. They would say, this is absurd. The Pope is transgressing his authority. Why? Because that action would be directly contrary to the common good of the Greek Catholics, and by extension, the Catholic Church, which respects its traditions, its various traditions, right? I want to address, though, an even more fundamental point. You said that obedience is the starting point of the ladder of sanctity. I would like to dispute that claim. I think that there are more fundamental virtues than obedience. First of all, truth is more fundamental than obedience. In other words, we must be obedient to the truth. I mean that veritas, that is, that which is true, is prior to obedience. The adherence that we have to the truth of the gospel, to the depositum fidei, and even to the liturgical heritage of the church, is prior, in a certain sense, to obedience. And also, I would say, love, charity, which concerns the good of the people, is something that puts limits on obedience. It puts limits on it precisely because obedience is in service of charity. It's not for its own sake. It doesn't exist for its own sake, right? And then I would also add that, at least for the Western tradition, humility is a virtue even more fundamental than obedience. Obedience, in a certain way, is rooted in humility. And that holds also for the shepherds, the rulers of the church. They too must be humble in the face of or in front of the truth and in front of the common good. And they should ask, before they do anything, will my action or will my command injure the common good? Will it injure the truth of the faith? And that's, I mean, just to give one example, we see that today with Traditionis Custodes. The Pope Francis is making the church a laughing stock in front of the rest of the world by attacking members, some of the most faithful and observant and diligent and knowledgeable members of the Catholic Church. He's attacking them at a time when there's heresy and schism and apostasy and immorality on all sides. There are a million other battles for the Pope or for any bishop to fight, but they have to fight against traditional Catholics or traditionalist Catholics. That is an absurdity, and it's a scandal in front of the world.
Chiaro. Un'altra riflessione. Mi viene in mente il caso di San Pio da Pietrelcina. San Pio fu perseguitato dalla Chiesa, fu addirittura sospeso. Eppure San Pio da Pietrelcina sapeva di essere dalla parte del giusto, diciamo così. Potremmo anche dire che San Pio fosse nel diritto di dire, di rispondere alla Chiesa: continuo a esercitare il mio ministero nonostante la sospensione, perché io ho ragione. Eppure sappiamo che non fu quello che fece, anzi disse, pronunciò una frase famosa: la mano della Chiesa è dolce anche quando mi percuote. Condivide questa analisi? Dobbiamo obbedire a Traditionis Custodes, al riscritto Roche? E in quale misura? Dovremmo fare come Padre Pio? Obbedire anche a quelle restrizioni che riguardano, che restringono cose oggettivamente buone?
Yes. Well, I touched on this earlier when we were talking about the Jesuit notion of obedience. Padre Pio is a religious. He belongs to the Capuchins, and therefore he owes a much more comprehensive obedience to his superior than, for example, a layman owes to his local pastor or bishop, or even, I would say, in a certain sense, even more than a bishop owes to the Pope. For example, a religious superior can tell his subject when to eat and drink, what to eat and drink, when to wake up in the morning, when to go to bed at night, that his job is simply going to be cleaning the toilets. I mean, he can do all of that. That's the radical side of religious obedience that a Jesuit or a Capuchin makes as a vow. However, Padre Pio was never asked to do anything wrong by his superior. He was asked to do or not do certain things, and he was willing to go along with that because he didn't see any error or theological heresy or immoral action being commanded of him. Yeah. However, if we look at the attack today by Cardinal Roche on the traditional Latin liturgy, we will see that his reasons for rejecting the continued use of the old liturgical books, his reasons are actually founded in theological errors. I would go so far as to call them heresies. For example, he maintains that the ecclesiology of the church has changed from before the council to after the council. Roche believes that the faith of the church has changed in such a decisive manner that the way that the church worshipped for over 1,500 years is no longer acceptable. This no longer expresses the teaching of the church or the faith of the church. That is heretical. That is impossible. No Catholic could hold that position. So it matters a great deal when it comes to obedience. It matters a great deal why someone is asking you to do something or not to do something. It really does matter. And if you can see that the campaign against the traditional Latin liturgy, not just the Mass, but all of the old rites, if you can see that that campaign is motivated by false ideas, then you must not obey on account of those false ideas. You at least need to recognize that you have an inherent right as a Catholic, an inherent responsibility to treasure the tradition of the church and to pass it on. This is not a negotiable item. This is not something you can just throw away and say goodbye, to thousands of years of worship. Right? And I say thousands because the traditional liturgy is in continuity with the Jewish temple sacrificial worship as well. There's a continuity. Our liturgy is 3,000 years old, I think you could say, in its roots, right? The Novus Ordo does not have that kind of history. It is a fabrication, a product of the 1960s and the 1970s. It uses material from the tradition of the church. It uses it the way a factory uses raw materials like steel and or iron and stone and wood. But it is a new rite. It is a new liturgy. It is something novel. Novus Ordo Missae. This is what it is. That doesn't mean it's invalid. I don't believe it's invalid. I believe it's valid. It doesn't mean that it may never be used. But what we can say is that there's no possible way for a pope or a bishop or a cardinal to abolish the old rites of the church without contradicting the faith of the church. That is what I'm saying.
Chiaro. La prossima domanda che vorrei farle è molto, molto diretta. Il Papa è obbligato a promuovere la tradizione e la liturgia tradizionale della Chiesa?
Mhm. Yes. So you bring up the question of the Pope's obligation or responsibility to tradition. And I gave a lecture about this subject a couple of years ago called The Pope's Boundedness to Tradition as a Legislative Limit. In other words, I looked at sources in the history of the church that pointed to the understanding of the limits on the Pope's authority with regard to what he can legislate in the liturgy. And I looked, for example, at the papal oath, which you can find as a historical document at a number of points. You can find this papal oath, and the papal oath says that the Pope pledges to receive the rights of the church and to defend them with his life. Okay, this is very serious. But also you find in the Profession of Faith of the Council of Trent the same kind of admission that the Pope binds himself to pass on the received and approved rights of the Church of Rome. And you can see this kind of language throughout the history of the church. These two words, received and approved, right? That is, the liturgy has been received from our forefathers, from those who came before us, but it also is approved by not just by the authority of the church, but by the authority of the common consensus of Christendom, by the use of all the priests, by the use of all the faithful. This is part of the sensus fidelium, really. That the Spirit of God has put his stamp of approval on the traditional liturgical rites of the Catholic Church. They can never be contradicted. They can never be suppressed. They can never be abolished. And that's what we have to stand on. We have to stand on this first principle. Ratzinger was very clear about this point. The Pope is not an absolute monarch whose will is law.
Chiaro. Ecco, un'ultima domanda. Lei ha detto anche che, ha già risposto ampiamente, che il Papa non può essere nemico del bene comune. Molti ritengono, tuttavia, che il Papa, nel momento stesso in cui proferisce qualcosa che puzza di eresia, diciamo così, o anche solo di eterodossia, ecco, nel momento in cui avviene questo, perda il munus petrino. Cosa ne pensa di questa idea?
Yes, well, those are really two questions. So the first question is about the common good and the bonum commune. And this is a crucial concept because any authority in existence, whether ecclesiastical or civil, secular, its raison d'être, its reason for existing is to serve the common good of the people over whom the authority is placed. This is the inherent purpose of authority. There would be no such thing as authority unless it served the common good. And so what is the common good of the Catholic Church? Well, you could define the common good of the Catholic Church in a number of different ways, but it at least includes the spiritual good of the faithful, their access to the sacraments, their access to enriching and nourishing forms of prayer for themselves, for their families. It includes authentic catechesis, orthodox catechesis. It includes good, faithful preaching. It includes support for marriage and family. All of these things are part of the common good of the church. And therefore, if any ruler in the church opposes himself to these goods of the faithful, he is attacking the very root of his own authority, the very foundations of his own authority. It's a kind of self-canceling move that such a person is making. So yes, the Pope can certainly act against the common good, and we've seen this happen in the history of the church. I'm convinced that a big part of the problem today is that Catholics are so ignorant of church history. And we tend to think about popes as if they're all saints. I mean, that's ridiculous. The popes are not all saints. There were many saints in the early church, most of them martyrs. And then we had periods of up and down. We had a saeculum obscurum in the 10th century. There was the so-called pornocracy, terrible, terrible era for the Pope, for the papacy. We had the Renaissance, the very worldly Renaissance popes, which was part of the reason why we had the Protestant revolt. And there have been a few cases, not many, but a few cases of popes who have gone astray in regard to doctrine as well. Pope Liberius, Pope Honorius, Pope John the 22nd, these are, so the point is that papal history is up and down. It's full of light and shadow, lights and shadows, and so we have to recognize that the Pope is not some kind of Delphic oracle who is like the mouthpiece of God. He's always speaking the truth. He's always virtuous. He's always a pinnacle of sanctity. No, this is not true. We can have bad popes. And that segues into your next question about the Petrine Munus, the office of the Pope. So it is true that if a Pope were a formal heretic, then he would lose his office ipso facto, because only a Catholic can be Pope. And a formal heretic has renounced the faith. He's no longer a Catholic. Obviously, if he's not a Catholic, he can't be in charge of the Catholic Church. So that's kind of obvious. However, it's not as easy as some people think to prove that somebody is a formal heretic. I mean, even with a layman or let's say a theologian, to prove that a theologian is a heretic, there's a whole process of investigation that has to take place. His writings have to be evaluated. Experts have to comment on what the heresies are, and then there has to be a trial and a confrontation. And you have to say to the supposed heretic, do you really believe X, Y, and Z? Do you really hold these positions? And if the person says, yes, I do hold them, and I intend to hold them, and I will not change my mind, then he's a formal heretic. He's a pertinacious denier of the faith. Unfortunately, it's not very easy to do that with the Pope, right? I mean, it's theoretically possible that the College of Cardinals, for example, could write up a charge of heresy against Pope Francis. They could say, you have said this, and this. These are heretical. I mean, in fact, this work has already been done. There have been a number of statements, public statements, that have identified the heresies, the material heresies, the apparent heresies in the Pope Francis. But no one has confronted the Pope to his face. And even if they did confront the Pope to his face, he could just ignore them the way that he ignored the Dubia cardinals. Right? Yeah. And so finally, it is, I think, possible that the College of Cardinals could meet and they could say, we have given the Pope a chance to renounce his errors. He has not renounced his errors. Therefore, we declare him self-deposed. That is to say, God has deposed him. We haven't deposed him. God has deposed him, or he's deposed himself, effectively. And we are now going to elect another Pope, right? That is a theoretical possibility. It's never going to happen, in my opinion, because the cardinals of the church, especially now, are not willing to do such a thing. They're simply not willing to. And many of them like Pope Francis and they agree with him. So I think that we are simply stuck. That is to say, we have somebody who is apparently the Pope. God knows if he's the Pope, but he is acting as the Pope. He's the only candidate for the papacy. Nobody has ever suggested that there's another Pope except Benedict. There were some people who thought Benedict was, but he's dead. So as far as I'm concerned, we treat Francis as if he is the Pope, but we resist him on any area in which we must resist him, according to our consciences that are formed by the truth of the Catholic faith and by our adherence to tradition. So I pray for the Pope. I pray for him every day. The priest at the Mass I attend remembers the Pope in the Roman canon. But we don't follow the Pope in his errors. We don't follow the Pope in his attack on the common good of the church. We cannot do that.
Professor. Let me introduce Professor Giovanni Zenone, who joined us a few minutes ago. Benvenuto, Professor Zenone.
Dear Peter, I'm very happy to meet you face to face through this instrument.
Thank you very much. It's good to meet you as well, Giovanni.
Great. I'm very happy. And I heard the last 7 minutes, 8 minutes of your speech. Great. I agree totally with you. And I think we have to fight and to go on in our with our fight to preserve the traditional faith, the traditional liturgy, and the truth that is the issue is that he is the Pope, and so who can judge him and depose him? God will not, he will not, and so we have to wait for the age.
Yes, and I mean, I think we should remember that the one Pope in history who was branded as maybe it's too strong to say he was branded as a heretic, but certainly Pope Honorius was condemned as somebody who allowed heresy to flourish. He was condemned, anathematized, excommunicated, but after his death. It happened after his death, right?
Yes.
And so I think that, God will judge, God does judge every Pope. He judges him when he takes his life, when he brings him to judgment, right? So no Pope is everlasting. And for us, that's a source, I think, of consolation to know that, that Pope Francis is only here for a time. He's a trial meant to strengthen our faith. I believe personally that Pope Francis has been the greatest advertiser of the traditional Latin Mass that we've ever had. We don't have enough money in the world to pay for the advertising that Pope Francis has given to the traditional Latin Mass. Everybody is talking about it now. The Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, it's on the front page of every newspaper in the world that the Pope is attacking the traditional Latin Mass. And people are saying, why is he doing that? Why can't he leave these people alone? So I think it's backfiring. What the Pope is doing and what Cardinal Roche are doing is backfiring.
Great. And you are doing a very good job also, because in Italian with Fede Cultura, we published 3 books of yours. We published Rinascita, about the Latin liturgy and how the ancient Mass is really necessary to rebuild the church. We published the Nobile Bellezza, Sublime Santità, the beauty, the wonderful beauty of the traditional Mass, and we published obviously the true obedience, la vera obbedienza nella Chiesa. I think that you are really an hero of defending faith, Catholic faith. Unfortunately, in US, there is much more strength, even in the bad field or in the good field. Here in Italy, we are in difficulties because we have Rome. We have Rome and we have had an history of Democrazia Cristiana, Democrats, Christian Democrats, and who continuously make a mix between God and the devil. They mix truth and lies, and it's much more difficult, I think, here in Italy than in US. There, the fields are more clear than here. What do you think about this?
It's true. I think that I wanted to make the point earlier that what is happening now in the attack on the traditional Latin Mass is also an attack on bishops. It's an attack on the authority of bishops, the legitimate authority. And what's ironic is that the attack is being made in the name of adherence to Vatican II. But Vatican II, in Lumen Gentium, paragraph 27, teaches very strongly that bishops are not merely vicars of the Roman pontiff, but they themselves are vicars of Christ for their own diocese, and they're in charge of making decisions about the good of the faithful over which they're placed. And that includes making discernments about when to dispense from rules that the Pope issues that the bishop judges are not suitable for his own people. So in the United States, I think we appreciate this principle of subsidiarity, this idea that the lower levels of authority should take charge of all of the affairs that pertain to them. And so the American bishops are more likely to think, we know the situation with our people. We know that they are not denying Vatican II. They're not denying that the council was a legitimate council. They're not denying the validity of the Novus Ordo. They're not making trouble. They're actually very generous, etc. So we want the Latin Mass communities to continue and to flourish, right? That's the attitude of some American bishops. That is the correct Catholic attitude, right? But, unfortunately, we also have in the church this heritage of ultramontanism, right? Where for 150 years or more, the attitude has been whatever the Pope says, everybody instantly has to do it, regardless of whether it's a good idea or a bad idea or a horrible idea. Everybody needs to immediately follow whatever the Pope says and does. And this is also not a Catholic mentality. Yes, we need respect towards the Pope, of course, and obedience when obedience is due. But that doesn't mean just being an automaton, like a mindless robot. And the Pope is just programming everybody to do whatever the Pope wants. I mean, that's a very bad thing, because if you have a Pope like Francis, who is sowing so much confusion on every level, right? It's actually the responsibility of the bishops to fight back and to reassert the truth of the Catholic faith, to say, no, we can judge the homosexual acts to be objectively evil. We can judge gay marriage to be wrong and to be harmful, and we can judge, the environmentalist movement to be something which is dangerous to the faith, right? We can do these things. Yeah.
So, what do you think? Lastly, now we have this Pope. We are suffering. Mm-hmm. We fear for the next Pope, because with all the Collegio Cardinalizio that he has done, full of people with the same mind of Pope Francis, is very difficult to have a Catholic Pope. Mm-hmm. What can you give us a word of hope for the future in the church? Mm-hmm. Despite this situation, or we have to fear more and more?
Well, I can give a word of hope in a few ways. One thing that we have to recognize is that there are many cardinals who are discontented with what's happening, who are actually angry about what's happening, upset about it. We can see that in this famous memo from Demos, which turns out to have been written by Cardinal Pell, whom, as far as I understand, many cardinals admired Cardinal Pell and listened to him. That memo, I think, expresses a kind of discontentment of many cardinals with the way that Pope Francis is ruling. Even the liberal and progressive cardinals feel destabilized and feel attacked by this Pope, because he's so chaotic and he's so anarchical and he's so tyrannical. So I don't think necessarily that the next conclave is going to give us a Francis II. I think it could give us a sort of a different kind of Pope. So probably not a traditionalist of any description, but at least a Pope who is going to stop ruling the way that Francis has been ruling, and perhaps a Pope who will say, as a true liberal should, I will allow whatever the people want. Okay, I mean, that's not a good attitude, but he would, if he allowed the traditionalists just to worship freely, that would be good for us, because we would grow naturally and organically. So I think if we had like a true liberal as the next Pope, then maybe that wouldn't be so bad for the traditional movement. I guess I would also just say briefly that we have to outlive the Vatican II generation. The bishops and cardinals in charge right now, all of them are nostalgic about the Second Vatican Council. It was their youthful, that was their hippie, youthful moment of, beautiful memories from their 20s or 30s or whatever. And that generation is going to disappear eventually. And as far as I can tell, the younger generations, they just don't have the same attitudes, the same antagonism towards tradition that the older generations have. So we do have to be patient and keep going.
Thank you.
Thank you, thank you. Grazie professore Peter Kwasniewski e grazie anche al professor Zenone per averci accompagnato in questa intervista che abbiamo fatto al professor Kwasniewski. Grazie ancora per le sue soddisfacenti, per le sue complete, chiare, cristalline risposte, come del resto ci aspetteremmo da un filosofo, da un teologo tomista. Grazie anche a tutti voi per aver seguito questa intervista e vi ricordo che potete trovare il libro del professor Kwasniewski, La vera obbedienza nella Chiesa, una guida al discernimento in tempi difficili, sul nostro sito www.fedecultura.com e ovviamente trovate anche gli altri titoli che vi ho illustrato all'inizio, ossia Rinascita e Nobile bellezza, sublime santità. Tutti titoli che parlano da prospettive diverse della bellezza, della fecondità e della profondità della messa tradizionale. Grazie ancora, alla prossima, buona serata. Have a good evening.
Arrivederci, grazie.